Before I check the focus, I'm just going to put the top on the camera temporarily. Now, there's a couple of screws I need to put in place first so everything's held down firmly. It's assuming I can find the right ones. Nothing should be too far away here, but that doesn't mean to say I can lay my hands on them immediately when I want to. That one, yeah. I had sorted these parts out so that I knew where everything was, but that was days ago, and my filing system was made to rules that I've since forgotten. That's looking good. Now you might remember that I said that this exposure meter was the wrong meter. That it should have had a piece that came along the front there which would stop the shutter release button from being able to revolve and get out of line with this, the film release button. And that's the case. It should have been a meter that looked exactly like this. It's got an extension here which stops that lever from revolving out of position. So this meter here I'm just putting in here temporarily while I test this, and then I've still got to make my decision about what I'm doing about this meter. So I'll get these two levers in position, get my meter correctly seated. The shutter release button can go on there. I can put the top cover on. Check that that all seats correctly. Now that didn't release the film release that time, so I know my adjustment is not correct. So let's roll that screw up a turn or so. 1, 2. Put the meter back in place. Put the top cover back in place. Still didn't release it, and by quite a margin. That screw needs to be rolled up a bit further than that. Half a turn, 1 turn, 1.5 turns. 1.5 turns is quite a lot. Get my meter in position again. Get the top cover seated. The shutter didn't release all the way, did it? Oh, it did. Let's try it on slower speed so we can see what's happening. That's better. Yeah, there's a problem there. I could hear that was very much a two-stage shutter. And that would be releasing the shutter after it had released the capping plate, I'd say. I wasn't noticing that earlier. Certainly releasing the film too early. The film released too early, so let's just take that back down a half a turn. Synchronizing that shutter issue is more of a problem. I may well have to have the front of the camera to deal with that. There's certainly a timing issue there. I didn't notice that earlier, so that suggests there's perhaps something else going on here. I'm watching the action of the mechanism. Yep, so the mirror and the capping plate were being released too early in the cycle. Can I see the adjustment screw? I can. The adjustment's made here, and you can loosen off these two screws slightly at the top, loosen them off quite a lot at the bottom, tip this plate back, and you get access to the screw for adjustment purposes. That is my next task. So I'll slacken off these screws slightly at the top. Not much, because I don't want to dislodge my gear engagement at the top. At the bottom, these screws could probably come out most of the way. Possibly even all the way without causing me any problems. And lifting this plate up, I can slide a screwdriver in here and get access to that adjustment screw. Of course, I've got to find a long thin screwdriver. My adjustment screw is down in here. I don't think you can see it on the camera, but it's well down in here. I'm seeing if I can get a screwdriver to engage with it. That one might be a bit coarse. Got to find one with a finer tip. Just moved that about a turn. Let's do these screws back up and test the action. See if we've made any difference. Oh yes, yes. Let's try that very slowly again. That sounded much more like it. I think we're in business. Well, that was lucky. Wasn't much toing and froing required there. Let's put that meter back on there. Get the shutter release button seated. Get the top cover in place. Hold that down firmly. That sounds much happier. The Film Advance releases correctly every time. So a couple of screws in this top cover to hold it in position. This provides me with a conveniently working camera. Oh, that was a bird hitting the window. So I can test my focus at the film plane. That's running nicely, so if I set this to B and F2, that should work nicely. I put a shutter release in there now. Shutter release cable, a lockable one. Now my shutter is open and I can check the focus at the film plane. Well, the focus reaches infinity at the film plane on a focusing screen before the focus scale ring is turned around to the infinity position, but only just before. So I slacken off my 4 screws there. My image was focused at infinity at this point. If I move that ring around to the infinity, to the end of the travel, and do my 4 screws up, if I've disturbed nothing, the focus mechanism will be where I left it, with the image correctly focused at infinity, but my focus scale ring is now at the infinity stop, so the two should match. And I'll check it and we'll find out. Well, it's nearly right, just very slightly focusing past infinity. So I've got to done the same thing again. I've set my focus to infinity on this screen. And now I'm going to move my focus scale ring round to the end of its travel, lock it there and check again. You can do this a number of times because what happens is often you'll find that the focus helical sticks to the back of your focus scale ring, and so when you think you're moving just the focus scale ring, you're moving the lot. Be a bit frustrating, but you go backwards and forwards a few times, you'll get there. That's fine now, that's exactly where it should be. So, you can have the joys of getting a focus scale back in place here now. The complication is getting it underneath this green lever here correctly and getting it seated. Oh, our chrome ring needs to go on there first. Let's get that in there. No wonder it was looking too easy. This has got a groove on one side that focus scale sits under. And we've got to get this hooked over the various protrusions. There we are, that's seated. And our focus scale ring needs to seat in there. I'm going to rotate this until the screw hole lines up with the correct position. We know that's the end of the travel, so the infinity mark should be about there. And it is. Okay, so it's got to go in here. Now I've got to make sure that this scale ring is seated correctly. It's looking pretty good. Now the screw is fairly large diameter head on this screw. It's quite short. Like everything else, it's chrome plated brass and easily damaged. So I'll get that in position. I'll make sure my focus scale is seated correctly and run that screw up. And look around here to make sure that it's sitting neatly. You should see a tiny edge of chrome around there. That looks very good. And the final thing here is the focus knob. Now with the Retina Reflex, the type 025, the earliest models, I think the earliest models had the focus knob on the other side or something. It was positioned differently. So some of them have the focus knob there. I think some of them have the focus knob around here instead. Without going back through my notes, I'm not going to know that, but I think that was the case. Okay, so we have a functioning camera. It would take photos in that manner. Of course, we have no prism in there. The finder assembly needs to go back in the camera body, and I need to come to some resolution of using the existing meter if at all possible and make some fix so that it works like this meter, which is one from my spares and may or may not be as good or better. It doesn't appear that it reads as high as the existing one. Of course, I haven't tested the original meter, the meter on the camera, to see how accurate it is. I suppose I could do that before I make any rash decisions. The question of what to do with this meter, it obviously lacks the extension at that part. What I've done here was I've taken the piece of plastic from another meter housing that I had about here, a broken meter housing, cut that piece off, and I've glued it to the inside of that top cover. And you'll see that if the meter is fitted, get that seated correctly, like that, that the shutter release button would sit down, put it in the right way up might help. The shutter release button seats down there like that, and the shutter release shaft would sit there like that. Now there's no way for that to revolve around to the front, so that means that it'll stay seated correctly over the film release. So that should neatly sidestep the problem I had with that shutter release not releasing the film at the same time. And that's because somebody had fitted an exposure meter like this when it should have had an exposure meter like this. Of course, these things happen over time. It's you don't know what people have done, why they did it. Well, there's even less chance that we'll discover why they did it. Presumably the original meter was dead, and some clever bright spark found this meter in their spare parts, and it doesn't look new. It doesn't look new by any means. It's a well-worn looking meter, and since we know the camera did not function well because the shutter release was very tedious to use. It means that this meter went into the camera, it was a well-worn meter. This is an example. This is actually new old stock. And you can see that that's very sharp, all the edges are sharp, everything's good. This one here, you can see that the edges are all rounded off, they're polished off from use. That's just contact with skin will do that. It just rubs the plastic away over time, just the handling of the camera. Anyway, that was definitely not a meter when a new meter when it was put in place. It was probably a second-hand meter, reclaimed most likely from a Retina 3C camera, I would imagine, 3 big C. But it wasn't suitable because it didn't have this extension which would stop the shutter release from revolving. So anyway, that's the answer to that top cover. So for my top cover itself, this is going to need a brief clean. It's not too bad. I'll have to clean my viewfinder window here just with a bit of glass cleaner and a cotton bud. Just make sure that the outside housing is as clean as I can reasonably get it, and that'll be ready to go on the camera. Which means that with that, let's get this, is this camera going to ever focus today? It's thinking about it. My next task really here is to put the prism in place if it doesn't require any cleaning, or dismantle it and clean it if it does. Let me inspect the prism. Now I can see this. You probably can't see any of that because it's not that obvious. But on the underside of this piece of plastic here with our split image on it, there are tiny dots inside there visible. Now they'll be mildew spots, and they'll be either on that surface of plastic, on the other side, not this face that you can clean, not that that's advisable, but on the other side, inside this construction, or they'll be on the ground glass screen. It means all this has to be disassembled to get to it. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is this, that the prism is clamped down to this with this bracket, and the bracket has some little rubber pads under it, and under the rubber pads there's a bit of foil tape there on top of the prism to stop the adhesive from the rubber pads causing the silvering to shed. And what's likely to happen if I remove those 2 screws and undo that clamp so that I can remove the prism, so I can dismantle this whole assembly here and clean the screen, is that at least 50% chance here that as soon as I remove those screws, lift that bracket off, with or without the prism firmly attached to it, that the silvering will come off. That the silvering underneath these pads will come away and there'll be dark patches in the finder. And that the only answer to that one from a practical point of view will be a new prism. So at the moment I've got a prism that's great. It's just like a new one. It's beautiful. The focusing screen has got dots all over it. They're mildew spots. I have to decide whether it's worth the 50-50 chance that we're going to have to replace the prism in order to go in and deal with those mildew spots, or whether it would be more practical to leave the mildew spots in place and use it exactly as it is. I'll pop this into the camera. You can see I had the film advanced at that stage to bring this lever for the frame counter well away from the prism. Well, I haven't screwed that down at the moment. I'm just going to put my top cover in place, look out the window and see what the image looks like. And it is there is certainly a huge number of black specks all over that screen, which is the mildew. Since one of the complaints from the owner was that the viewfinder was dirty, well, that's the only dirt, we're going to have to get it apart. So I'll start with these two screws. Now, it wouldn't be so bad if the screws and the bracket were the only thing holding us down here, but there is also tape. And the tape potentially could cause us grief too. Okay, so there's the prism. It's come off with our bracket. Now that prism looks really good. The silver loss there, there's virtually no silver loss. That looks really good. I do want to set this back down again with more tape. The tape is a dust trap. Basically it's to stop dust from getting into the finder. Let's pop that to one side. That prism's in really nice order. You wouldn't be able to tell that from a new one to look at. Now here is the finder assembly. We've got one screw here holding that mask on at the back. Now I notice that screw and the other two screws that held that bracket in place were all slightly loose. They've just rattled loose over time most likely. I don't think anyone's been in here. This sticky tape will have it off. See, the adhesive's given up pretty much. This yellow stuff that you see here, that's the adhesive. That's off the back of the tape. That's not the tape itself. There's more tape here. As you can see, it's not really sticking. Now I've got to get this apart. Now it'll have 2 or 3 spring clips here. I'm just pushing on the ends of the tabs of those spring clips to push them through. It's clipped into little slots in the case. That's those retainer springs. Now there's 2 in this case. There's normally 2, sometimes there's 3. I don't think I've ever recalled seeing 4 anywhere. And we can tip these components out. Now this is a condenser lens. It's biconvex and it's symmetrical. Then there's a separator. This piece. Now it's not symmetrical. You see that the ends here are raised. The shallow raise, that goes towards our biconvex condenser. So you see that here it supports the condenser in the middle there. It supports the condenser in the middle there. So that's the shallow raise. That goes to the condenser. The other one, the more severe one, that goes to this other lens here. Now this one is plane on one side, convex on the other. Plane side goes down, of course. Underneath that, there's this mask. It's a little metal mask. And underneath the mask, you can see the ground glass screen. There are 6 screws that locate the plastic screen in here. They're used to adjust the position of it left or right, up or down, in order to centre that split image in the ground glass screen, in the hole in the ground glass screen. Now those screws need to come loose. Hopefully I can get a screwdriver engaged with those without any fight. These have been sealed with some lacquer, and the problem there of course is that you can't start splashing acetone around on here because that plastic screen would turn to custard in about 5 seconds. So usually I just slip back these screws off one turn, no more than one turn, otherwise they'll fall out, which isn't a bad thing, but they're easily lost. You only want them to come out when you're ready for them. And you can see that's well stuck down with lacquer. Yep, that's loose. That's it. That was enough for the ground glass to fall out and the plastic. Now the ground glass. The ground side goes down. That goes to the plastic screen. The shiny side goes up. Our plastic screen here, the plain side goes down. The side with the prism on it goes up. This is, looking at this, I don't think you can see that. Let's see if we can get in the light. Yeah, you can see it there. You can see that there's a dull patch right in the middle there. I don't know what's done that. It's probably just dirt. And you can see that at the surface, and catch the light. The surface is quite dirty. It's absolutely covered in little specks. Those specks are mildew spots in the main. Yeah, there may be a bit of dust there, but it's nothing to speak of. To clean this stuff, these are very delicate. You touch that with a cotton bud and you scratch it. It's a very soft plastic. The way I clean these is I put them in a clamp, holding it by the edges, and they go in the ultrasonic cleaner in some warm water with a bit of dishwashing detergent. And I find that's a good way to get those mildew spots off there without actually having to physically touch it with anything else, and avoids abrading it. Once they've been through the ultrasonic cleaner and it's all nice and clean, I just rinse them off under a hot tap, and then I blow all the moisture away from it with a blower, rocket blower, while I'm drying it with a hairdryer. You need to keep removing any droplets that are sitting on there, not just dry them in place, because if you dry them in place you'll end up with coffee rings on there, which will be quite obvious. That surface where the prisms are, that's at the focus plane. You will see them in the finder if you've got any dust, specks or coffee rings or anything there, it'll certainly show. So this has to get sparkling clean. And you have to do it without getting your fat fingers on there or wiping at it with anything. So that's my task for that. I'll just pop these little pieces carefully to one side because I've got to deal with these one after another. And the housing here, our little box that all this sits in. We've got our 6 screws, 2 at the front, 2 at the back, and 1 at each end. I want those screws out, and I'm going to clean